The World Bank last Friday had approved a $500 million loan to the Philippines. With us now for more is Antonio Tony Lambino, the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Finance. Good to see you, Tony. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Kathy, and good morning to all your viewers.
Before we get to the loans, I just wanted to get the Finance Department's view on the significance of the twin surveys, the Rapid Consumer Assessment and the Survey for Business Owners. How will the results help in getting the economy back on track and transition to the new normal?
Well, yeah, as previously mentioned, the strategy of the government really has four pillars. The first is to respond to those who are most in need immediately, which is why we have the Social Amelioration Program under the Bayanihan Law. The second is to make sure that we marshal our resources to help our frontliners fight COVID and to help the health system build up its capacity for testing. The third, to make sure that there's enough liquidity in the market in order to keep the economy afloat. So for instance, what the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas did in lowering the reserve requirement by 200 basis points. The estimate is 220 billion pesos in liquidity in the market. And this is the fourth pillar that we're talking about, which is what the surveys are informing. And the fourth pillar is really about the economic recovery plan so that we adjust to whatever the new normal will be post-COVID. And that's where the surveys come in. So for the business survey, it's about asking micro, small, and medium enterprises primarily what their pain points are. And there were around 44,000 respondents to this survey. And what we're finding is we're going to need differentiated responses depending on the situation of the company. So for instance, there are the very highly vulnerable companies that will need the most public investment because their operations ceased completely during the enhanced community quarantine. There are those that are of medium vulnerability, maybe a partial or a temporary closure, but we expect that their business will continue after the lockdown or that it continued in a limited sense. And what they need based on the survey are things like access to finance. And that's why in the small business program that was just approved last night, we include a credit guarantee because it's very difficult to access credit during times of crisis. And the third component is making sure for those who are not so vulnerable that we support them. So for instance, in the small business program, while their operations may have continued, there may be workers who were not able to come in due to quarantine rules or other considerations. And that's why we have the wage subsidy program for the workers so that they can keep their jobs even throughout this quarantine.
All right. So given the knowledge that we need to differentiate the response for aid for the small and medium enterprises, what's the worst and best case scenarios for the economy post the ECQ and post the COVID crisis?
Well, overall, the estimate is that our GDP growth will plunge to maybe zero or even move into negative territory. The latest estimate is a potential negative 0.8% GDP growth. However, that is shared across the world. Now, we are not the only country that will be experiencing that. In fact, a global recession was already announced by international organizations. So in terms of overall productivity, we have lost a lot of it. But what does that mean for the Filipino people? We're expecting a temporary loss of around 1.2 million jobs. And that's why we need to keep our investment program in place alongside all of these emergency actions so that we can get jobs back and move the economy forward and make sure that people get back to work. That would be a huge priority for the new norm.
Yeah, to get to best case scenario, the government will need to borrow money. And the Finance Department is proposing a 51 billion peso program to help the middle class families. But in the absence of a national ID system, how do you intend to rationalize the distribution of financial assistance or aid, especially to those households that have yet to receive the aid?
Well, for the 18 million households in the informal sector, that was primarily covered by the Listahanan, which is a scientific approach to having sort of a census of poverty in the country, and that's with DSWD. For the small business program, we do have taxpayer information from the BIR that, of course, is confidential, but the BIR itself is able to help identify employers that are qualified on behalf of their employees for this wage subsidy program. We also have data from the SSS. So those are the two main sources of information for targeting this program for the workers of small and medium enterprises.
In terms of asset sales, Tony, what is planned on that front to help raise money? Because the president mentioned selling government properties along Manila's reclamation areas.
Well, in terms of the fiscal position of the government and the economy in general, we come from a very strong place pre-COVID. We have had decades of strong fiscal management, which is why our credit rating was upgraded recently from BBB to BBB+, and which is also why our lenders are willing to lend us during this crisis at very high levels and at concessional rates. So that is something that we need to maintain. So far, the resources that have become available through not just international lenders, but also through the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas are sizable, and we will make sure to invest these resources in the most effective and efficient way possible. But at the same time, these resources at this point are not inexhaustible. So what we have to be very prudent and careful, and any borrowing, we have to realize, of course, that we will have to pay back later, or future generations will have to pay back. So on behalf of all of us and of the future generations, we need to be very pragmatic and responsible in the way we spend these resources.
So no asset sales plan by the government to raise money?
What we're focusing on right now are the use of the special, expanded, but temporary and limited powers over the budget that the Congress provided to the President through the Bayanihan to Heal Us One Act. There are sources of funds that have been identified to fund the emergency subsidy programs. But yes, additional borrowing certainly is on the table.
On borrowing money from the multilateral institutions, the World Bank's approved $500 million of a loan, but that's under 10% of the $5.6 billion the finance secretary said he's eyeing, as mentioned during the televised briefing with the president on April 9th. So how much loan or assistance is being worked out with the Asian Development Bank?
Well, it's a combination really of the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the AIIB, and even bilateral lenders. So it's the total program that the Secretary of Finance, Carlos Dominguez, was talking about. So all of that together is around $5.6 to $5.7 billion. Announcements will be made as agreement is signed.
As to the breakdown between AIIB and ADB?
Yes, the announcements will have to be made as the loans are signed, because that's the general practice when it comes to this area.
All right, but how much would the target be for commercial borrowing requirements for the COVID-related stimulus? What's planned on that front?
Well, that would be sort of the next step after we are able to put in place the resources from both domestic borrowing of the government, from international lenders. For the domestic borrowing, it was announced earlier that the central bank, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, has put in place 300 billion pesos to support our efforts through the purchase of government securities. And then you have the around 310 billion pesos from international lenders. And if needed, then we will go and access financing from the private sector, but that would be a lower priority than the others that I've mentioned.
So taken together, fiscal and monetary actions combined, what size of a budget deficit relative to GDP will we see for 2020? Well,
the economic managers pre-COVID mentioned that the threshold would be around 3.6%. We're now seeing an adjustment upward toward around 5.3% of GDP.
All right. Well, keep us up to speed on the numbers. Thank you so much for joining us, and keep well. ASEC
Thank you,
Tony
Kathy.
Lambino.
Please stay safe.